She was barefoot, her clothes torn from months on the streets, but her eyes, those eyes burned with something fierce. A desperation, yes, but also a secret she wasn't ready to share. Not yet. The millionaire stood in front of her, his expensive suit a sharp contrast to her ragged appearance. He was reaching for the pen, about to sign the secrecy agreement that would seal the deal, one that could change everything for both of them. He had no idea what was coming. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, her voice hoarse but urgent. Her fingers trembled as she pointed to the contract on the table. "Don't sign it. It's a trap." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and for a split second, time seemed to freeze. The millionaire's eyes narrowed, skeptical yet curious. He laughed softly, dismissing her warning. But there was something in her voice, something he couldn't ignore, a flicker of truth that made his heart race. The pen hovered above the page. One move, one decision, and the course of their lives would change forever. He hesitated, just for a moment. Then the door slammed open, and the real danger walked in. What happens next? That's a secret only the story will reveal. The city skyline stretched out before him, a shimmering testament to wealth and power. Towering glass structures gleamed in the fading sunlight, their surfaces reflecting the kind of world many could only dream of: luxury, success, and influence. From the penthouse of his exclusive tower, everything seemed under control, perfect. Ethan Harper, the man at the helm of this empire, leaned against the floor-to-ceiling window, his hand resting on the polished edge of the desk. He wore an air of quiet confidence, as though he had long since conquered his demons and ascended to a place where the rules of others no longer applied. Every day had been a triumph. Every decision he made had been calculated, controlled. But today something felt different. It wasn't the usual thrill of a big deal on the horizon or the satisfaction of another successful investment. No, today something was gnawing at him, a feeling he couldn't shake. He gazed out at the city below, his reflection merging with the skyline. He had it all, the mansion, the cars, the jets. And yet, he was constantly running from something, though he couldn't pinpoint what. The soft chime of his phone broke his reverie, and with a swift motion, he picked it up. The message was brief. "The girl is here." His fingers hesitated over the screen, but he didn't need to ask who. He knew who it was, the girl who had appeared out of nowhere, a ghost from his past. The girl who was about to change everything. The office door creaked open, pulling him back to reality. The assistant, a young woman named Samantha, stepped inside, her smile polite, but her eyes betraying a flicker of uncertainty. She was always perfect in her professionalism, but even she couldn't hide the unease that lingered around the edges of her smile. "Mr. Harper, the meeting is ready," Samantha said, her voice steady. But Ethan could tell. There was something off about today, a shift in the air he couldn't explain, a tension that hummed beneath the surface. He nodded, his gaze drifting to the corner of the room where a large mahogany table stood. The contract was already laid out, the ink on the paper almost ready to seal his fate. Yet, as he approached the table, his eyes flickered to the chair on the other side. Empty. The girl hadn't arrived yet, but something about her absence felt more ominous than the usual waiting game. There were whispers, rumors about her. Some said she was desperate, others said she was dangerous. But why would someone like her, someone with nothing, pose any real threat to a man like him? Then, without warning, a flash of memory hit him. A night years ago, a car crash, a woman's scream. The girl, running. She had looked so different then, so scared. And yet, there had been something in her eyes that night, something unforgettable. "Sir." Samantha's voice broke through his thoughts, pulling him back. "Shall we begin?" Ethan shook his head, dismissing his thoughts. "Yes," he said, voice firm, but deep down his stomach churned. What was about to unfold in that meeting? He wasn't sure, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the stakes were higher than ever before. And then, from the corner of the room, the sound of footsteps echoed, soft at first, then growing louder. The door to his office opened, and there she stood. As the door swung open, the tension in the room grew palpable. Lena Wolf stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. She exuded power, her presence commanding attention in a way few could replicate. A notorious figure in the corporate world, Lena had built her empire through ruthless tactics and cold, calculated moves. She was the one who never lost. Beside her, Marcus Drake, the investor and tech mogul, lingered in the background. His broad shoulders and steely gaze were designed to intimidate. But it wasn't his size that made him dangerous, it was his mind. A mind that knew how to manipulate situations, twist them to his advantage, and bend the world to his will. They were here for one reason, and one reason only, to control Ethan Harper. But their plan wasn't just to take him down, it was to make sure he never rose again. The secrecy agreement that Ethan was about to sign would bind him into a web of legal entrapments, a labyrinth of lies that would leave him powerless. Lena's voice was a velvet whisper, but underneath it was a steel edge. "You understand, Ethan," she said as she glided across the room. "Once you sign, you are ours. Every move you make, every penny you earn, it's all ours. There's no going back." Marcus added, his eyes cold and calculating. "You were too trusting, too naive. The city never forgets a man who falls from grace. And now you'll join those who are forgotten. There's nothing left for you but to sign." Ethan felt the weight of their words settle over him like a heavy shroud. They weren't just after money. They were after control, and they'd been pulling strings behind the scenes for far too long. The deal was more than business, it was about crushing any opposition to their empire, and Ethan was in their way. A cold, sick feeling churned in his stomach. The stakes had escalated. Signing the agreement wasn't just a mistake. It was his downfall. And yet, something in the pit of his gut told him there was still more to this story, something darker that he wasn't seeing. In the shadows, Amelia, a homeless woman who had been living on the streets for months, had no idea how she had gotten caught up in this. She had been living in the alleys and parks for far too long, but it wasn't the harsh life of the streets that had led her to the penthouse tonight. It was sheer, dumb luck, or fate. Amelia had known Ethan Harper from years ago, but only by reputation. A man whose name filled headlines, whose face appeared in every business magazine. But the man she had seen from a distance, the man who once saved her life when she was just a runaway, wasn't the same person now. He was trapped, just like her. It had all started with a tip from an old acquaintance. A man from her past. Someone who had seen something she didn't. He warned her about a meeting at Harper's penthouse. There were talks of a contract, a deal too dangerous for Ethan to sign, but the specifics were unclear. He only knew that if she didn't act, everything Ethan had worked for would be stripped away in one fell swoop. Amelia had tried to ignore the voice that nagged at her, but something about the urgency in the message stuck with her. She had to do something. As she crept through the hallway, her heart raced, her mind swirling with questions. What was Ethan Harper involved in? Who was behind this plan? And how could she possibly stop it? She wasn't a hero, just a girl who had been running her entire life. She caught sight of a crack in the door and froze. She could hear the voices inside, sharp, smooth, like a well-rehearsed play. Her instincts screamed at her to turn around and leave, but her feet betrayed her. She stepped closer, her body trembling with fear. She couldn't be here, but she was. Amelia stood frozen just outside the penthouse door, panic clawing at her chest. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she strained to hear the conversation inside. There was no time. She needed to warn Ethan. But how? The whole world seemed against her. The weight of the secret she had uncovered weighed heavily on her mind. The deal. The trap. She had to stop it. But who would believe her? She was a nobody, just a girl who barely knew the man inside. Her fingers fumbled as she dug into her pocket, pulling out a scrap of paper with a hastily scribbled phone number. The one person who might be able to help, a journalist from an old contact. She could send a message. But how would she explain it all? She couldn't. Not yet. Suddenly, the door creaked, and she quickly ducked behind a nearby pillar. She held her breath, praying they hadn't seen her. Through the crack, she could see Ethan standing across from Lena and Marcus, looking uncomfortable, like he was trying to understand what was happening. The weight of the contract lay on the table between them, the pen inches away from sealing his fate. And yet, Amelia could feel the power of the room shift. Something wasn't right. She stepped forward slowly, only to realize that Lena had her eyes fixed on her. How did she know? Was this part of the plan all along? Amelia's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't hesitate. She had to act. She had to warn him. But before she could speak, Lena's voice cut through the air. "I'm afraid you're too late." Amelia's breath caught in her throat. Amelia's heart thundered in her chest as she stepped into the penthouse, the weight of her discovery heavy on her shoulders. She could feel the eyes of Lena Wolfe and Marcus Drake on her, their calculating gazes like daggers. Ethan, frozen in place with the pen hovering over the contract, didn't seem to understand what was happening, his brow furrowing as he looked between the two conspirators and the figure standing in the doorway. Lena's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I see we have a guest," she said, her tone dripping with amusement. "Ethan, you can't sign that." Amelia's voice trembled, but she couldn't afford to show fear. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. Ethan turned, his eyes wide, as if unsure if he was seeing her. Amelia, his voice wavered, but there was no time for a reunion, no time for anything else. I don't know who these people are, but they're lying to you, Amelia shouted, her voice cracking as she rushed forward, desperate to stop the deal from going through. That contract? It's a trap, Ethan. If you sign it, they'll own you. They'll control your life. You'll never get out. Marcus laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent a chill down her spine. She's right about one thing, Ethan, but she's too late. The deal is already done. You're ours. Amelia's blood ran cold. The words hung in the air like poison, sinking into Ethan's heart. She could see the realization dawning on him, how deep the betrayal ran. His trust had been shattered, not just by the people in this room but by his own ignorance. He had trusted them and now he had walked straight into their trap. No, Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. It can't be. Lena stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she moved in on him. You didn't listen, Ethan. You didn't see it coming. But you should have. We've been playing you from the start. Amelia could barely contain the rage that surged through her. This was the moment. She had to do something. Ethan, I know you. You're stronger than this. Amelia pleaded, but her words seemed to falter in the air, drowning in the weight of Lena's words. Ethan's face twisted in confusion. The pain in his eyes was clear. He didn't know who to trust anymore. That's enough, Marcus said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. You've interfered for the last time, Mississippi. Now get out, before things get worse for you. But Amelia didn't budge. Not until I expose what you've done. I won't let you destroy him. Not again. She didn't have the answers, but she knew that this was no longer just a business deal. This was something darker, something far more dangerous than she had anticipated. Ethan looked between her and the two figures who had orchestrated his downfall, a tortured look on his face. How could I have been so blind? He muttered. Then suddenly he turned toward the desk. The pen. With a flick of his wrist, he pushed the pen away, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The world around them seemed to pause as the realization that he wasn't going to sign sank in. But just as quickly as hope flared, Marcus moved. He was fast, far too fast. The deal was never meant to be stopped by words. In a single, fluid motion, Marcus reached for the contract, ripped it from the table, and flung it into the air, watching as the sheets scattered to the floor. Do you really think we're going to let this go that easily? Betrayal had a way of morphing into something far uglier when it was exposed. Amelia felt her chest tighten as Marcus's words sank in. He wasn't just playing a game. He was prepared to go to any lengths to win. Time slowed as chaos erupted around them. Ethan's eyes burned with defiance, but he knew he couldn't beat them alone. This was no longer just about business, it was about survival. They were going to crush him unless he took action now. Amelia, still frozen in place, felt the realization hit her like a wave. She couldn't stop them by shouting. She couldn't stop them by pleading. But there was one thing she knew they hadn't accounted for. The trap they had set for him had already been triggered, and now it was time to turn the tables. She had to act fast. Without thinking, she grabbed the papers that Marcus had thrown aside. She didn't know the specifics, but she did know one thing. The key to exposing their scheme was hidden in the fine print. The agreement was designed to force Ethan into a deal he didn't understand. But Amelia had spent enough time in the underbelly of the city to know how these things worked. With trembling hands, she scrolled through the contract, her eyes scanning the lines, looking for the loophole, the hidden clauses that would tear the entire deal apart. There it was, a line buried deep in the legal jargon. A clause that ensured Ethan's consent would be nullified if he had been under undue influence at the time of signing. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. This was it. She had the leverage. Ethan, she shouted, holding up the contract with the crucial clause visible. This whole thing is a setup. They've been manipulating you from the start. This clause, this contract, it's void if you're coerced or manipulated. They can't control you, Ethan. Not legally. For a moment, the room was still. Lena's eyes narrowed as she saw the clause, and she looked at Marcus, her expression hardening. They weren't prepared for this. Ethan took a step back, his hands trembling as he processed the revelation. You're right. They were using me. The realization hit him with full force. Everything they told me was a lie. Marcus's face contorted with fury as he lunged toward the papers, trying to snatch them away from Amelia's grasp. But Amelia was already one step ahead. She had anticipated his move and, with a swift motion, kicked a chair into his path, causing him to stumble. Amelia turned to Ethan, her voice urgent. We need to get out of here now. You can still fight this. We can still fight them. For the first time since she'd entered the penthouse, Ethan looked like he might have a fighting chance. The weight of the situation was far from over, but the immediate threat was neutralized. With Amelia's quick thinking and the exposure of their legal trap, they had gained the upper hand, for now. Lena was fuming, but she knew they were out of time. Her plan was unraveling. "Get them!" she screamed, her voice rising in fury. But it was too late. The truth was out. Ethan's empire wasn't theirs to take anymore. Amelia stood tall, her breath steady, but inside, her heart raced. This was only the beginning. The battle was far from over. The real fight had just begun. The city skyline glimmered outside the window, the lights of downtown twinkling like stars in the night sky. But inside Ethan's penthouse, the air was heavy with silence. He sat on the edge of the plush leather couch, staring at the floor as his mind replayed the events that had brought him to this point. His empire, his success had been built on trust. He had trusted Lena Wolf, trusted Marcus Drake, trusted that the people closest to him had his best interests at heart. But in a single moment that trust had been shattered. He had been played, used. Betrayal wasn't a concept he could fully understand until it happened to him. There had always been whispers in the back of his mind about his business dealings, about his choices. But he had brushed them off, too sure of himself, too confident in the network he had built. He had been naive, and now he felt the weight of it crashing down on him. The last few days had been a blur. Running, hiding, negotiating with lawyers, trying to salvage what little he could from the wreckage. But nothing felt like it mattered anymore. Ethan rubbed his face with his hands, the exhaustion settling deep in his bones. Amelia's face flashed in his mind. She had been the only one who hadn't abandoned him, the only one who had risked everything to save him. And yet, as much as he wanted to thank her, to express the gratitude swelling in his chest, there was something else gnawing at him. He had let his pride blind him to the truth. He had let Marcus and Lena manipulate him, and in doing so, he had almost lost the one person who cared enough to stop it. He didn't know if he could ever repay her for what she had done. Amelia, her bravery, her persistence, it had saved him. But at what cost? She had been put in harm's way because of him. Ethan stood up suddenly, the weight of his thoughts unbearable. The world outside his window was moving, continuing as though everything was fine, as though nothing had happened. But he knew better now. Nothing would ever be the same. Nothing could ever be the same. It wasn't long before Amelia found herself standing outside Ethan's office again. The building gleamed in the sunlight, but the weight of the past few days was still heavy in her chest. She had saved him. She had saved his empire, helped expose the truth, and yet, there was a nagging feeling deep inside her. The fear that, despite everything, things would never truly be right between them. She knocked on the door, her heart racing as she waited for a response. The sound of footsteps approached from the other side, and the door creaked open to reveal Ethan. His expression was tired, but there was something different in his eyes, a depth that hadn't been there before. "Amelia," he said quietly, his voice low and filled with something she couldn't quite place. "Come in." She hesitated, but only for a moment, before stepping inside. The room was larger than she remembered, yet somehow it felt smaller now. As if the walls were closing in, both figuratively and literally. Ethan motioned to the chair across from him. "Please sit." Amelia did, but she remained silent, unsure of how to start. The last few days had been a whirlwind, and everything between them felt so different. She didn't know if she could face him without feeling the weight of the betrayal he'd suffered. "I don't know where to begin," Ethan said, his voice breaking the silence. He sat across from her, his gaze steady and unwavering. "But I have to say it, thank you, for everything." Amelia felt a lump form in her throat. "I just did what I thought was right." Ethan smiled, but it was a bittersweet expression, tinged with regret. "You saved me, Amelia, not just from them, but from myself. I let them use me. I was blind, and I almost lost everything." Amelia swallowed, trying to fight back the tears that threatened to spill. "You don't have to thank me. You were the one who fought in the end." Ethan shook his head. "No, I wasn't. I didn't see the truth until it was too late. But you knew. You always knew. And you didn't give up on me." Amelia looked away, unable to meet his eyes for a moment. His words were sincere. There was no doubt in them. But how could she explain how much it had cost her? The sleepless nights, the fear that she might lose him forever. She had been just one step away from losing everything herself. "Ethan," she began softly, I never wanted to get involved in all of this. It was never about the money or the business. It was about you. I care about you." There was a pause. The air between them seemed to thicken with unsaid words, but neither one of them spoke. They just sat there, letting the silence stretch between them. Finally, Ethan stood and walked to the window. "I don't know what the future holds," he said quietly. "But I do know one thing. I've lost so much because I couldn't see the truth. But I don't want to lose you, Amelia." Her heart skipped a beat, and she stood up slowly, walking toward him. "You won't. Not if you don't let me." Ethan turned to face her, his eyes full of uncertainty, but also hope. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out for hers. When she took it, it was as if a weight had been lifted. The past few days of turmoil and confusion suddenly felt distant, like a bad dream that was now fading away. They stood there for a moment just holding hands, and in that moment they both understood. This wasn't just a business deal anymore. It was about something far greater. It was about trust, redemption, and the future. "I don't know how I can ever repay you for what you did," Ethan said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. Amelia smiled gently. "You already have. You're here. You're safe." And in that moment, with the weight of everything they had been through, they knew that they were no longer the same people they had been when this journey began. They had both changed, and together they would rebuild stronger than before. In the end, the journey of betrayal and redemption teaches us that trust is a fragile thread that binds us together. But even when that trust is shattered, it is through courage, loyalty, and the willingness to fight for what's right that we find true strength. Ethan and Amelia's story is a reminder that even in the darkest times, when everything seems lost, there is always the possibility of healing. The power to choose what happens next lies in our hands. The choices we make today shape the future, whether it's rebuilding from the wreckage or finding redemption in the moments we least expect. Let's remember that the battle for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth fighting for. If you've enjoyed this intense tale of betrayal and redemption, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Join us next time for another journey into the unexpected, because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that challenge everything we thought we knew. Stay tuned, and be ready for the next twist.